My name is David Whitmore. I'm 54 years old and I just destroyed the most important day of my only daughter's life. As you listen to this, she's probably crying in front of an empty wedding hall, surrounded by waiters with nothing to serve and musicians who will never play a single note. The most painful part for her isn't the silence. It's knowing that I was the one who pulled the legal trigger that shut everything down. Just a few hours ago, my daughter looked me straight in the eyes and told me that my presence would ruin the aesthetic of her perfect wedding. She said my clothes, my rough hands, and the life written on my face didn't fit the prestigious new family she wanted to belong to. She banned me from the celebration that I personally paid for, down to the very last dollar. But she forgot one small detail. In the business world, the person who signs the checks has total control. And my patience ran out the exact moment she handed me an invitation without my own name on it. She wanted a fairy tale wedding. What she forgot is that I own the castle, the banquet, and even the carriage. Betrayal has a price that apologies can't cover. And today I came to collect that debt in the coldest way possible. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, hit like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons no one forgets. To understand how we reached this point, I need to explain who I was to her. I'm not a man of soft words or constant hugs. I'm a man who understands the world through effort. For 30 years, I woke up at 4 in the morning to build a logistics company from nothing. My hands are scarred, my knees crack when I stand, and my eyes carry the permanent exhaustion of someone who never allows himself to fail. Everything I did, every contract signed, every sleepless night checking inventories, had a single purpose: making sure my daughter Vanessa never lacked anything. I wanted her to have the life I never had, a life without shortages, the best schools, clothes that weren't hand-me-downs. Vanessa grew up watching my success, but I don't think she ever understood the sacrifice behind it. To her, money was something that simply appeared on a credit card. When she turned 21, I gave her her first luxury car. She didn't receive it with arrogance, or at least that's what I told myself. She accepted it with the natural ease of someone who believes the world owes her everything. Our relationship seemed stable, or at least that's what my blind father's heart believed. I was the provider, the pillar, the man who solved every problem with a phone call or a bank transfer. She called me Dad with a smile whenever she needed to cover an overdraft, and I, out of love or stupidity, always gave in. 2 years ago, Vanessa met Julian. He comes from a family obsessed with having a last name, people who live for appearances, golf clubs, and photos in society magazines. Julian doesn't have a real job. He manages investments, which in reality is just his parents' money. From the very first day, I felt them looking down on me. At dinners, Julian talked about expensive wines and trips to Europe, while I stayed silent, watching my daughter slowly adopt the same air of superiority. Vanessa began to change the way she dressed, the way she spoke, and most painfully, the way she introduced me to her new friends. I was no longer my father, the businessman who built everything. I became simply Esteban, who works in transportation. When Julian proposed, Vanessa came to see me with a list that looked like the budget of a small nation. Imported flowers, a venue that only opens for the elite, a banquet designed by a Michelin-starred chef, a dress that cost more than the annual salary of my best employees. She hugged me, called me the best dad in the world, promised this wedding would be the pride of the family. Moved by what I believed was her happiness, I agreed. I signed every contract. Put my personal credit card as collateral for the venue, the catering, the alcohol, and the decorations. The total cost reached a number that would make anyone tremble. But for me, it was the final gift, the closing chapter of my role as her protector. For months, I paid every bill. Vanessa sent me photos of menu tastings and floral arrangements, but she never invited me to a single meeting. She said she was too busy. That Julian and his mother, a woman who looked at me like I was an insect, were handling the aesthetic details. I didn't question it. I thought my daughter simply wanted everything to be perfect. I pictured myself walking her down the church aisle, handing her over at the altar, feeling like I had fulfilled my mission. I was wrong. The atmosphere grew tense a few weeks before the wedding. Vanessa stopped answering my calls as often. When I did manage to speak with her, she sounded evasive, uncomfortable. Once I heard her mother-in-law in the background saying, "I hope your father understands that there are certain standards we must maintain at the reception." I said nothing. I kept my composure. I'm a businessman. I know how to read between the lines, but I refused to believe my own blood could be ashamed of me. At home, the emotional climate was one of artificial calm. I kept working. I kept paying. While they, in private meetings, decided that I wasn't elegant enough for their new life. 3 days before the wedding, Vanessa asked to meet me at a discreet cafe. Not my office, not my home. She wanted neutral ground, where no one knew her. She arrived with a folder and a cold expression I had never seen before. There was no "Hi, Dad," just a long sigh. She sat down across from me and, without touching her coffee, dropped the bomb. She said Julian's family was very strict about protocol, that the guest list was limited, and that, to avoid awkward moments due to my lack of social refinement, they had decided it would be best if I didn't attend the ceremony or the reception. "You can say you're on a business trip, Dad. No one will suspect anything," she said casually. In that moment, the ground disappeared beneath me. I didn't feel immediate anger. I felt absolute emptiness. I looked into her eyes, searching for the little girl whose scraped knees I used to clean. Instead, I saw an ambitious, shallow woman who viewed me as an inconvenience. She wanted my money, but not my presence. She wanted the shine of the gold I produced, but despised the coal on my hands. I stayed silent as she kept talking about how understanding I had always been. That was the biggest mistake of her life. She confused my generosity with weakness. She thought I would accept the humiliation with my head down, like I always had. But that afternoon, as I paid for that final conversation, something inside me broke forever, leaving room only for a cold, unshakable determination. I stayed seated in that cafe long after she left. Vanessa walked away with a light step, probably relieved to have gotten rid of the problem that was her father. She didn't say goodbye with a kiss, just a condescending pat on my hand. As I watched her disappear, 30 years of hard labor crashed down on me like a concrete slab. I had been a fool. I had built a pedestal for someone who saw me as nothing more than an ATM. That night I didn't sleep. I sat alone in my office in the dark, with a glass of whiskey I never touched. I replayed everything. I remembered when she was 8 years old and promised I would always be her hero. Then I remembered her face from earlier that day, the look of disgust when she said my presence would ruin the photos. The betrayal wasn't being excluded from the wedding. The betrayal was that she allowed me to pay for every flower, every ounce of caviar, and every bottle of luxury champagne, knowing full well she planned to leave me outside the door. She used me to buy herself a new identity, one where I didn't exist. The next morning I received an email from the wedding planning company. It was the final schedule. In the section labeled Seats of Honor, my name was nowhere to be found. Instead, Julian's father, a man who has never worked a real day in his life, was listed to take the main spot during the toast. Vanessa had even sent a note to the decorator. "Make sure the style is old money. No rustic excesses or people who look out of place." The message was clear. I was the rustic excess. I was the man who didn't belong in the life I had paid for. What hurt the most wasn't the lack of an invitation. It was the cold precision of the deception. She waited until I paid the final deposit on the venue, due 48 hours before the event, to tell me not to come. It was a calculated move, a financial ambush. If she had told me earlier, I might have reacted differently. She wanted to secure the money first, then discard the provider. I felt like an object, a tool used to open a door, then thrown away for making the entrance dirty. By mid-morning, Vanessa called me. For a second, I thought she had regretted it, that her conscience had finally spoken. She hadn't. She called to ask if I could transfer an additional $10,000 because they had forgotten to include smart lighting for the dance floor. Her voice sounded sweet, almost childlike, the same voice she used when she was little and wanted a new toy. "Dad, it's the last detail, I swear. Julianne says without those lights the entrance will look cheap. Can you do it today?" she asked, as if she hadn't shattered my heart the day before. I stayed silent for a moment. I felt pressure in my chest, but when I spoke, my voice was steady, almost monotone. "All right, Vanessa, you'll get what you deserve," I replied. She celebrated on the other end of the line, said, "I love you," mechanically, and hung up. Those were her last words to me. "I love you." A cheap lie worth $10,000. In that instant, the sadness vanished, replaced by a silent rage and a mental clarity I only feel when I'm about to close a difficult deal. The humiliation turned into fuel. I went to my office and locked the door. I didn't call anyone. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. I simply opened my safe and pulled out the original contracts I had signed with every single vendor. Vanessa, in her arrogance, believed that because the wedding was hers, she owned the services. But legally, I was the sole client. The contracts weren't under Vanessa's wedding. They were under Esteban Morales. Every clause, every cancellation policy, every termination right belonged exclusively to me. I spent the afternoon reading the fine print, the venue, the catering, the orchestra, the photography service. Every one of them had a last-minute cancellation clause. Yes, I would lose part of the money to penalties, but I would keep enough to teach them a lesson they would never forget. My daughter wanted a perfect wedding without her father. She would get exactly what she asked for. The problem for her was that without my presence, there would be no wedding at all. The symbolic expulsion was complete when, that same afternoon, I received a photo by text message. It showed Vanessa, Julian, and his parents raising glasses at a private rehearsal dinner. The caption read, "Finally just us, the family we always dreamed of." I wasn't in the photo. I wasn't in their plans. I wasn't in their hearts. They erased me before the event even began. They took away the emotional home I thought I had with my daughter. They stripped me of my honor as a father and treated me like a stranger with a thick wallet. That night, while they dined and laughed, I made calls, short calls, professional calls, without emotion. I spoke with managers, company owners, and security coordinators. I explained that due to a drastic change in circumstances, I was cancelling all services immediately. I didn't care about the penalties. I didn't care about the money lost. The cost of my dignity is priceless. When I ended the final call, I felt a strange sense of peace. The trap was set. They would arrive at an empty, dark, silent venue, and for the first time in her life, Vanessa would have to face the consequences of her actions without Dad there to pay for the mess. My plan wasn't born out of a burst of anger. It came from ruthless business logic. In business, when a partner betrays you and breaks the agreement, you cut off the supply. Vanessa had broken the most sacred agreement of all, gratitude. So I proceeded with the liquidation. The first thing I did was call my trusted lawyer, Marcos. We met in my private office that same night. There was no drama. I laid the contracts on the desk and explained the situation with the cold precision of someone analyzing a profit and loss statement. Marcos looked at me with a mix of surprise and respect. He knew how deeply I loved my daughter, but he also knew I was a man of principles. "Esteban, if you cancel now, you'll lose at least 40% of the deposits due to the termination clauses," he warned, adjusting his glasses. "It's not a loss, Marcos," I replied, staring out at the city through the window. "It's an investment in my self-respect. I want every contract revoked. I don't want a single chair moved in that hall. I want the catering staff to not turn on a single stove, and most importantly, I want venue security to have clear instructions that the event has been cancelled due to non-payment by the contract holder." Marcos nodded and began drafting the legal notices. Nothing was left to chance. The key to any good strategy is timing, and I planned to wait until the very last possible moment so they would have no chance to react. If I cancelled days in advance, they might have taken out a loan, or Julian's father could have tried to cover the expenses. But if I did it on the wedding day itself, they would be finished. The logistics of an event that size can't be improvised in a few hours. I spent Friday, the day before the wedding, working as usual. My secretary asked if I needed a driver reserved for the event, and I simply told her my plans had changed. Meanwhile, messages from Vanessa kept coming in on my phone. Photos of her hairstyle, complaints about the weather, reminders that I should not even think about showing up at the hotel where Julian's family would be getting ready. I read everything, I replied to nothing. I let her believe that her submissive, hard-working father was at home, quietly accepting his fate. That afternoon, I made the bank transfers to cover the cancellation penalties. I spoke personally with the owner of the event venue, a man who knew my history and owed me a few favors from the past. "Esteban, are you sure about this? Your daughter will be there in just a few hours," he said on the phone, his voice uneasy. "I'm sure. The contract is in my name and I've decided the event will not take place. If they try to enter, inform them that the contract has been terminated by the holder. Don't give long explanations. Just tell them there is no event," I said. My voice never trembled. To make sure the blow was total, I contacted the orchestra director and the floral service. I paid the full penalties, but asked for one additional favor. Do not inform the bride. I told them it was a surprise on my part, that I would handle the communication. In the world of money, people don't ask questions when the check clears. Everyone agreed. Saturday morning, the wedding day, I woke up early. There were no nerves, only icy determination. I made myself a coffee and sat down to read my company reports. While Vanessa was surely surrounded by makeup artists and photographers, convinced her grand entrance into high society was guaranteed, I was dismantling her stage piece by piece. At 2 in the afternoon, 4 hours before the ceremony, I received a message from Marcos confirming that all vendors had received the notarized cancellation notices and that the penalty funds had been processed. Legally, Vanessa's wedding no longer existed. There was no banquet, no music, no flowers, and most importantly, no venue. I put on my best suit, not to go to the church, but because a man should look sharp when making the hardest decisions of his life. I sat in my library and placed my phone face down on the table. I knew what was coming. I understood the rhythm of the storm. First confusion, then desperate calls, and finally rage. I felt like a chess player who had delivered checkmate long before the opponent realized they had lost their queen. My daughter had banned me from her wedding because she was ashamed of my origins and my presence. She wanted the party, but not the man who made it possible. Now she would have exactly what she asked for, a wedding without my presence and without absolutely anything else. The reconstruction of my life began at that moment. I would no longer be anyone's ATM. I would no longer allow my effort to fuel the ego of people who despised me. My patience had turned into armor, my solitude into my greatest strength. I was ready to watch from a distance as the house of cards Vanessa and her new prestigious family had built collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. The chaos began exactly at 4 in the afternoon. My phone, resting on the wooden table, started vibrating with almost violent insistence. Vanessa's name flashed on the screen. I didn't answer. I let the silence of my library be the only judge. I knew exactly what was happening. The decoration team had arrived at the venue only to find the doors chained shut and security handing them a contract termination notice. Then the messages started coming in. At first, confusion. "Dad, there's a mistake at the venue. They say we can't get in." 10 minutes later, desperation. "Answer. Julian and his parents are here. The guests are about to arrive. Do something." I poured myself a glass of water, my movements slow and deliberate. I pictured the scene clearly. Vanessa in her dress worth thousands of dollars, standing on the sidewalk, watching the flower trucks turn around and leave because the final service payment had been revoked. At 5 in the afternoon, I received a call from Julian's father. That one, I decided to answer. I wanted to hear the voice of the man who planned to take my place during the toast. "Esteban, what the hell is going on?" he shouted, completely losing that old money elegance he was so proud of. "We're at the club entrance, and they're telling us the contract was cancelled by you. There are 300 people on the way. This is a public humiliation." "Good afternoon, sir," I replied calmly, a calm that only made him angrier. "I'm simply applying a policy of transparency. My daughter informed me that I didn't fit the aesthetic of this event. Since I am the contract holder and the sole payer, I decided that if my presence would ruin the party, it was best that there be no party at all." I paused. "You're a man of status, aren't you? I assume you won't have any trouble pulling out your checkbook and fixing this little inconvenience right now." There was a deathly silence on the other end of the line. He knew, and I knew, that he didn't have that kind of money available, nor the ability to organize an event of that scale in 30 minutes. "You're bitter. A small man," he muttered before hanging up. I smiled to myself. I am not a small man. I am the man who built everything they were trying to enjoy. Minutes later, my daughter called me from one of her bridesmaids' phones. This time I answered. Her voice was a mix of sobs and rage. "You've ruined my life!" she screamed through tears. "Everyone is staring at me. Julian's parents say I'm a disgrace because my father can't keep his word. How could you do this to me on my wedding day?" "I didn't do anything to you, Vanessa," I replied, my voice icy. "You made a business decision. You decided my presence had no value. I simply accepted your decision and withdrew my capital. You wanted an elite wedding without your rustic father. Now you're free to have the wedding that you and Julian can afford with your own effort. Enjoy your afternoon." I hung up. The impact of the revenge felt like poetic justice running through my veins. I stood up and walked toward the window. I imagined the banquet that never happened, the lobsters still sitting in the supplier's kitchen, the champagne never leaving the cellars, the orchestra packing up to play somewhere else. But what I enjoyed most was the image of Vanessa's mother-in-law. That woman so obsessed with protocol, trying to explain to high society guests why they were all standing in an empty parking lot without even a glass of water to offer. Vanessa had tried to use me as a stepping stone to climb into a world she didn't belong to. I simply removed the ladder while she was at the top. The humiliation she wanted to spare herself by hiding me, or banning me, came back to her multiplied 1,000 times. In her social circle, this would be the end of her reputation. No one forgets a wedding cancelled at the venue entrance due to non-payment by the embarrassing father. There were no screams from me, no public scene. It was an administrative execution. The traitor was punished with the only currency she understood: loss of status and absolute deprivation. While they faced uncomfortable questions from the guests and the contemptuous looks of in-laws, who now saw Vanessa as a liability, I sat down and enjoyed the silence I had paid so dearly to earn. The irony was delicious. She wanted to be the center of attention, and she certainly was, just not as the perfect bride, but as the woman who was exposed and cut off at the most public moment of her life. 6 months have passed since that Saturday, and the silence in my house no longer feels like loneliness. It feels like victory. Through third parties, I learned that Vanessa and Julian's relationship didn't even survive a honeymoon, which, by the way, never happened because I also cancelled the flight and hotel reservations. Julian's love and his parents' acceptance disappeared the moment they realized Vanessa was no longer the heiress to an accessible fortune, but the daughter of a man who refuses to be stepped on. Without my money, she stopped being charming to them and became an inconvenience. Vanessa tried to reach out to me several times. She sent emails full of self-pity, talking about forgiveness and blood ties. I didn't respond to any of them. Blood gives you relatives. Loyalty gives you family. And she gave up our family the day she decided I was an aesthetic inconvenience. Now she works in a clothing store owned by an acquaintance, earning just enough to finally understand what every bill costs, the same money she once spent without a second thought. I don't feel joy in her suffering, but I do feel deep satisfaction in her learning. Life is a cruel teacher, but it's the only one whose lessons are never forgotten. I've restructured my will and my companies. A large portion of what would have been her inheritance now goes to foundations that support young entrepreneurs who, like me, came from nothing and know the value of effort. My employees now receive better bonuses, and my company is stronger than ever, because it's led by a man who no longer has emotional weak points. I've learned that being a good father doesn't mean being a martyr. It means teaching respect, even if the lesson requires burning the entire stage down. Sometimes at night people ask me if I regret being so harsh, if it hurts to have lost my only daughter. My answer is always the same: I didn't lose anyone. The daughter I thought I had never existed. She was just a creation of my generosity. The real woman was the one who banned me from her wedding, and I don't want that woman in my life. My conscience is clear because I acted with the same coldness I was shown. Justice isn't always a courtroom. Sometimes justice is simply letting people taste the poison they prepared for others. She wanted a wedding without her father, and I gave her exactly that. Now she has a life without her father, and I hope she enjoys it with the same intensity she enjoyed planning my humiliation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories.